that was as far as we got, and we want to flesh out today, we want to flesh out these two concerns, which again are not, they're not, it's not an either-or situation. We're not trying to say, oh look, the rationalists are right or the empiricists are right. So what we did the last day as well was we mentioned that we can take any complicated, complex domain like mathematics or cooking, and we can view it from the point of view of rationalist concerns. We can look how certain is the knowledge obtained, how free of delusion from illusions, for example, is it? Or we can look at how is that domain structured by our activity, by our sensing, by our feeling and touching, and so on. So we can use these as different lenses to view the world. Now we're going to go back and we're going to associate one landmark philosopher with each of these positions. That's, of course, these guys are much more multifaceted than that. They did much more, and these issues are actually discussed by everybody, really, somewhere along the line. But we want landmarks here. And there's no better landmark for the rationalist position than Rene Descartes, who sports this absolutely amazing hairdo. He lived in the first half of the 17th century, so he died, I think, in 1650. Yep. You've all heard of Descartes. Those you remember from mathematics, the Cartesian system of equations. He was the mathematician who united the study of algebra with the study of geometry, giving us this Cartesian coordinate system where every point in the plane has two numbers associated with it. So he was a mathematical genius. He was working at a time when people didn't feel the need to identify themselves as either scientists or philosophers or mathematicians. In fact, those distinctions hadn't really been made yet. Thinkers about the natural world, like this guy, were sort of natural philosophers. That meant both scientist and philosopher and often mathematician, all at the same time. And Descartes was a bona fide genius. He was a brilliant thinker who made some very, very clear and cogent arguments that we've never managed to quite get away from. So there's arguments that still occupy us today, even though this was a long time ago. Everybody, I think, has probably heard the single most famous sentence in Western philosophy, which is what? I think, therefore I am. Exactly. Thank you. Yes, cogito ergo sum, if you like it in Latin. I think, therefore I am, is from Descartes. And what we're going to do is we're going to see, how did that come about, this weird statement? What does it mean and what does it tell us? It's a kind of an odd position to be in. Now, as well as recognizing that in the first half of the 17th century there was no clear distinction between mathematics, science, philosophy, and such, another thing we have to recognize is that the role of religion with respect to what we now call science or philosophy was much muddier. It wasn't nearly as clearly separated as we are now. We like to say, okay, you go to church, you say your prayers, that's one thing. You go into the laboratory, you use your test tubes, that's another thing. Let's keep those nicely separate. Well, that certainly wasn't the case at the start of the 17th century, and Descartes was a Christian whose questioning was motivated in part not only by scientific motives but by religious motives. And he wanted to justify, among other things, his religious belief. He might even have got into trouble if he had reached conclusions that were completely at odds with the church, although I'm not sure we should think of him as navigating towards a fixed final point. I think he was more of an open mind than that. But certainly the religious background of this is important, and very often when we're looking at how we arrived where we are today with the concepts we have today, it's useful to look at these landmark figures and, among other things, ask ourselves, what were their religious commitments? How did their belief in matters related to churches and gods and authority, how did that influence the science or the philosophy that they did? In Descartes' case, he wanted justified belief. He wanted to believe really, really strongly. And so he wanted to clear up and figure out, well, which of his beliefs could be wrong and what could he actually know for sure? Most of us don't spend every day going around like this. We sort of get by. But he was asking a very fundamental question. And his starting point reminds me of Doubting Thomas, who we met in the first lecture. Doubting Thomas wanted proof. Some people had come to him and told him that Jesus had risen, and he wanted proof of this. And the proof he wanted was he wanted to see it for his own eyes. He wanted to be present with Jesus. He wanted to feel it, touch it. You remember this role of the senses and all this activity. So he was very much, he started from a skeptical position, not just accepting what you're told, and he wanted to figure it out for himself. He wanted evidence that he could believe in. So he wanted, he wanted to feel and see what was being claimed. Now Descartes is in many respects like Doubting Thomas. He starts off and he articulates a skeptical position. He starts off going, I could be wrong about an awful lot of things. Now, we've already established he's no dummy, right? He knows a lot of things. He knows, for example, about optical illusions. If you stare at that, does it seem to move for you? This doesn't always work on the screen. Is it moving? Little bits of it? It kind of works better on paper. You've seen enough optical illusions anyway. This is just standing in for the general field of optical illusions. If you see something moving here, there is nothing moving on the screen. Yeah, it works a bit for me anyway. So he knew that the eyes can be fooled, that what you see, maybe the risen Jesus was a hologram as well back then and wherever it was. So what you see is not necessarily, is no guarantee that what you see is true. And he also knew about hallucinations, right? Lots of people experience hallucinations. If you've never had them yourself, you've heard of other people having hallucinations. And you don't even have to get into that kind of bizarre territory of visions and hallucinations. We all dream. And in dream you see things that are not necessarily true, I think. I don't know. I'm not sure whether you see things. Certainly it seems to the sleeping subject that there's something present that is not actually in fact present. So Descartes knew that his senses could be fooled. He knew you couldn't necessarily trust him. So here's a skeptical cat who's joining our ranks now of Descartes and Doubting Thomas and being skeptical. If the senses can be fooled, how can knowledge that you get through the senses, how can that be grounded? How can it be certain? Now we're using Descartes as a poster boy for rationalist concerns. So it was not going to come as a big surprise to you that Descartes' view on the matter was that reason was the thing that was going to establish certainty. You didn't establish certainty through seeing something, you established certainty using your massive powers of intellect and the workings of reason. You could come up with something that was more certain. So what can you reason about? Well, it puts you in a rather difficult position, doesn't it, if you don't trust your senses, if you're going to go, that could all be wrong. And here, Descartes performed a kind of a thought experiment that we'll meet in two further versions, and you're certainly familiar with one of them, maybe both of them. I'm going to give it to you, first of all, in Descartes' own words. And we're not going to do a lot of PowerPoint karaoke here. It's not very great fun for you sitting there. And if I stand here and read something and you sit there and you can see it already, it's kind of annoying, isn't it? But we're going to do it a little bit just with Descartes for the following reason. Philosophy is not always easy to read. If any of you have been tempted to pick up a work by, for example, Heidegger or Kant, you might go, oh my God, I'm going to go do something else. Because it's really, really difficult to read, often deliberately so, you might think. And the funny thing about Descartes is that although he's from a long time ago and he was writing in French, he wrote very clearly, and he still reads well today. So you can understand him. So that's why I want to actually introduce you to his own words. So here's Descartes not trusting his senses, sort of closing himself off from all that and saying, well, what can I know for certain? So suppose, for the sake of argument, you've convinced yourself that there's absolutely nothing in the world. No sky, no earth, no mind, no bodies. Now he asks, does it follow then that I don't exist? And he says, no. And then he does something clever. He imagines that there's an evil demon trying to fool him, providing him with the sensory material to convince him that he's standing here lecturing to a bunch of people when he's actually not, for example. So he says, if there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me, in that case, I too undoubtedly exist if he's deceiving me. And let him deceive me as much as he can never bring it about that I am nothing, as long as I think that I am something. You see what he's doing? He's saying, I could think I'm a white rat going down the rabbit hole. I could think I'm anything. I could be completely wrong about everything. But the one thing that even the wrongest knowing subject can't avoid is that there's a knowing subject, that someone is wrong. So this is where he comes to say, and he doesn't actually say, I think, therefore I am. He says, je suis, j'existe. I am, I exist. This is the one thing he believes that you cannot doubt. This is from the second of what's this little series of, I think, 6 meditations, which are very short, so clearly written, and they raise arguments of such substance that we really have to address these today still. This is a little bit more from Descartes. He said the further the mind is taken away from its proper objects, which he saw was as logic and pure reason, the more likely it is to fall into error. So he saw the intellect and the power of reason as delivering truths, and he saw this kind of experiential, oh look, I see something kind of knowledge as suspect, slightly suspect, it could be wrong. And he said the purpose of philosophy is to direct the mind away from what he called the confusing images of the senses. And he thought reason gave you instead indubitable truths. This is a very serious objection. It's not easy to argue your way around all this. Descartes then takes this as a starting point, and he goes somewhere else, somewhere I think completely indefensible, somewhere nobody really wants to follow him today. But his starting point is really, really important and hasn't gone away. This skepticism, this argument that you could be completely wrong, but you would still exist. Now, I said this argument is known in at least 2 other formats, one of which you're probably familiar with. Let's start with the so-called famous brain in a vat experiment. This is a thought experiment, not a real experiment. You can't do it. This is an updated 1970s version in a world that's full of computers and language of information and all this kind of thing. And it comes from the philosopher Hilary Putnam. The idea was, well, maybe Descartes' right, maybe you're just actually a brain sitting in a vat, and because you know about the world, everything you know comes in through your senses, so we can provide the right inputs to your nervous system, and that'll go into the brain. And if the brain seems to, I think I'm waving my hands around and moving, but maybe we could just take the output signals from the brain that would have moved, that thinks they're moving hands, and change the vision of the world that the brain has, provide the right inputs and outputs, in other words, and perhaps we could fool the brain into thinking that it's actually out there gambling in the meadows. It's a thought experiment because ain't nobody done this, and there's an awful lot of assumptions here which are questionable, but it's interesting to see Descartes' argument presented in a thoroughly modern framework. And then, who here has seen The Matrix, the first one? If you haven't seen it, watch the first Matrix as homework, okay? Don't bother with 2 and 3, they're crap movies. But Matrix number 1 is really, really good. And it starts off with this questionable premise that, hang on, whoa, there it is. This questionable premise, we're farming humans, and the humans have no idea that they're being farmed because we've jacked into their nervous system and we're providing the right inputs and collecting the right outputs so that they all think they're actually walking around living and breathing in the world of 1999 of all things. It's an intriguing concept. The Wachowski brothers who made The Matrix didn't invent it. This is exactly the same idea as the brain in a vat. It's the same idea as Descartes' starting point. Like I say, we don't have to necessarily go where Descartes went to recognize that it's a sufficiently interesting problem that is going to recur again and again. The way it's expressed, whether we're being farmed by aliens or machines, or whether we're a kind of a computer located in the brain, it's going to be, that language is going to change over the years and depending on who's doing the thinking. But Descartes' starting position is one that doesn't go away. Now, what Descartes then did was not something we want to follow him in. He decided to do exactly what I claimed in the last lecture you can never do. He said the mental is separate from the physical. This introduces a form of dualism. Dualism is when you have 2 incompatible things. You've got here the mental and the physical. And Descartes went further. He said there are different kinds of things. He used the terms res extensa for material things that take up space, extended in space, and res cogitans for the mind, for the intellect. And he thought that they were completely separate. Now, there's a problem that happens if you think of the mind as separate from matter. Here's the problem. We have a very good view of how matter works. We have mechanical theories that describe perfectly how things move, how they bounce off each other, how motion gets passed around in the world. for inanimate objects. But when it comes to the living, watch this, matter just moved. Matter just moved from there to there, and unfortunately, mechanics alone won't describe that, because in order to describe why my hand went up, you have to appeal to my desire to move my hand up, my desire to illustrate a point to you, my volition or will. So I intend to move my hand up, and lo and behold, my hand moves up. So we've got some kind of interaction going on between mental stuff, which is my desire or intention, and physical stuff, which is my hand, which is extended. How does that happen? How do you make the link between the two? Now, here Descartes came up with a rotten solution. I'm praising him to the hills because I think he's brilliant, even his hairdo, but his solution to this was not a good solution. Back then, in the beginning of the 17th century, there was a lot not known about the body, and there's a little gland buried deep in your brain called the pineal gland, and nobody knew what it was for. It was just a little bit of tissue in there in the brain, and haven't got a clue what it was for. So Descartes more or less said, give me that. And he suggested that this was the point at which the mental influenced the physical. So we've got an actual site of interaction, right? We know enough about the pineal gland. That's not what's going on. Nobody believes this to be a working solution. This doesn't explain or account for anything. It's a rotten solution. It's a pity. It'd be nice to have an answer. And in fact, there is no solution to this problem. What we've just done, though, however, is we've illustrated a conundrum describing how do we accommodate the view of the mental together with our view of the physical, recognizing that they're problems that co-define each other, and we end up with a whole bunch of positions that are possible. And we're just going to take one look at this, and then we're going to back away slowly because, oh my God, we don't want to get involved, okay? We're going to take a little look at it. What we're doing here is the business of metaphysics. What's physics about? That's what metaphysics wants to ask. Or what kind of things are there which we can talk about? Now, we've just identified Descartes' view on this. He's what's called a substance dualist, suggesting that mental and physical are different kinds of substances. That's P here, what's the physical and the mental there, as if they were separate. Now, not everyone's happy with that, and sometimes people say, oh, you're so dualist. Well, let's be monist, which means there's only one kind of thing, and then our causal stories, what affects what, are much easier to describe, and there's various varieties that have been tried out, and some people like them more than others. So the first one, physicalism, also known as materialism, says, you know, all that mind stuff, well, that's not really there. Really, there's just a whole bunch of material. All that really is matter, and someday, when we understand more, for example, about brains, we'll be able to do away with all this mind talk, and we just have a single theory of how matter behaves. So that privileges matter over mind. Some people like that, some don't. There's an alternative, which is to go the other way, and this is most commonly associated with an Irish philosopher called Bishop Berkeley. And this is the position that, you know, all that problem you had, well, it's not. The answer is not to stop believing in yourself or stop believing in your own experience and perception and feelings. You don't want to give all that up. Matter is easier to give up. Matter is just something that you kind of made up in your mind. Bishop Berkeley suggested, you know, everything is actually made of mind, and matter is something that appears to mind. It's sort of a hallucination, or it stands in some relation to a subject. It has no independent existence. That's known as idealism, and lots of people don't like that one either. You see, none of these positions are satisfactory. Lots of people don't like the idea that if I tell you, no, rocks aren't really real, you go, no, get out of here, rocks are really real. You don't want me to tell you that your views on things are not really real either. So there are other approaches to this. Here's an approach known as neutral monism, which suggests that actually what you see as material stuff and what you see as, or interpret as mental stuff, they are both different aspects of a single underlying reality. This, if any of you have ever dabbled in Indian philosophy, will be a more familiar position to you because it's been well worked out there in all different kinds. And we're not going to get into it. We're not going to take a stand on this. We're going to leave this. Metaphysics really, really worries about this. And we didn't come here to do metaphysics. We came here to do another branch of philosophy, which is epistemology. We came here to figure out what knowing is. There was a philosopher called Kant who came long after Descartes, who sort of divided up philosophy into metaphysics and epistemology, and ethics was the last big area, as if they were all separate. But what we're seeing here is that you can't really keep these questions apart. We want to know what knowledge is, but that means we want to know about the subject who knows something. Descartes called it the cogito, that which thinks. And we want to know about, well, what's the view of the world, what is known. We have to we'll be forced to take a stance somehow with respect to this. So we're ending up in a big mess, you'll agree. I suggested we want to back away quietly from all this and leave it to the philosophers. And we're going to have one little look, though, just to see what are some kinds of solutions that are available to you if you want to develop an account of how mental events and physical events interact. So remember I said I want my hand to move up, I decide to make it move, I intend, and it moves up. Magic! So the mental and the physical have somehow interacted. How do we deal with that? Here are 3 positions. You don't have to learn these off, okay? I'm just using them to illustrate what a can of worms we've accidentally opened up here. So interactionist dualism suggests that something physical affects something mental, and then something mental affects something physical, and they go back and forth like this. And that's not dissimilar actually to substance dualism, which was Descartes' idea, because in order for this to work, you have to allow the physical to affect the mental, and then you have to allow the mental to affect the physical. It produces this disjointed view of what's going on. But Descartes, with his view of the pineal gland, actually had this available to him. He had a locus, and a site at which 2 different kinds of things could interact. But like I said, nobody's a substance dualist these days. You don't get far. It doesn't work out if you start to think of mind as if it was made of something which was not matter. Here's a rather depressing view known as epiphenomenalism. Oh my God. So here you've got a bunch of physical events that are going along, billiard balls bashing into billiard balls in accordance with Newtonian mechanics or something like this. Nice physical stuff playing out. And here you've got a bunch of mental events, such as, oh, I intend to move my hand. Oh, look, I realize I moved my hand. I'm all happy. But actually, the mental events are not causing anything. It's all an illusion. You're just spectator of your own life, which is unfolding in front of you, and you have absolutely no influence on things. So like I said, this is a really depressing view of the relationship between the mental and the physical. It's a view that has been adopted in some rather batty religious circles, so extreme forms of Calvinism that decide everything is predetermined. You don't actually influence things. It's God already knows everything that's going to happen, and you think you're influencing things. That's just an illusion, so that all your experiences are, they don't actually influence things at all. That's really depressing. It sort of solves the problem, but it does throw the baby out with the bathwater and makes you a helpless spectator of your own life. Or here's another one, which is also not great. We've got a bunch of physical events going on following the laws of physics, balls bashing into balls, causing balls to move, that kind of thing. We've got a bunch of mental events going along. We've got my desire to lift my hand, my happiness at having lifted the hand. All these are following in succession. No clash arises, but nothing mental causes anything physical, nothing physical causes anything mental. And the apparent alignment of these, the fact that, oh look, I wanted to move my hand and then my hand moved. Well, we have to evoke some kind of third party to do that. And you know what the usual answer there is? God. So someone's in charge of keeping all this in place. Remember that thing about God being omnipotent, being everywhere all at once? Well, that's why, because he's busy knitting these things together. You're probably not going to be happy with that as a solution to this already. So now we are definitely going to back away and leave the metaphysicians to get on with their metaphysics. I'm not going to suggest to you that you actually are a brain in a vat, or that you actually are being farmed for bioenergy by machines. We're going to go a little bit with common sense on this. But here's a little bit of kind of a dirty secret of cognitive science. I'm saying we're backing away from this because it looks like, this is not the problem we came here to solve. But we never get very far from it. And sometimes people act as if they were beholden to substance dualism or epiphenomenalism or panpsychic parallelism or any of these other bizarre solutions that seem to solve these problems. So the fact is, scientists couldn't be arsed doing metaphysics. They want to get on with doing science. They want to set up experiments, do measurements, construct theories. That's what the business of science is. The trouble is, all science is done within one framework or another. Scientists are very often not even upfront or aware of the framework in which they're doing their science. And in cognitive science, well, that's where the framework really, really matters. So we're always making assumptions which, if we stood up in court, we might not want to defend. Or we might. Most scientists will happily admit that they're open-minded about the solution to these intractable philosophical problems. I hope that much of open-mindedness exists in science. But when we are interested in how we as knowing subjects come to know the world, the trouble is we're never far from them. So we're always kind of forced to adopt, at least for today as a working hypothesis, a position with respect to what minds are, what the world is, and so on. We'll see at the end of this little section, we'll see one strong position as scientists coming out and saying, look, here's the answer to these bloody metaphysical problems. Can we now get on with doing science? Okay? So some scientists do say that. So we're never far away from these issues. Right. I did say at the start that this course was not going to be big on answers, but was hopefully going to be big on questions, that is, lead to improved questions. Well, I certainly demonstrated my inability to come up with any answers to anything, but at least we now have two dimensions along which we can sort of improve the questions we might have had at the start about what it is to know the world. We've got the rationalist and empiricist concerns, in which we're going to consider first the role of the intellect and reason, and then the role of the senses and human activity and experience. And as we go forward, we've got, this is an unpacking of the concerns. We'll be interested in all these aspects. So we will later on in this course, we'll have a whole lecture on reason, for example. We'll also be discussing how we act, how we move, and we'll be discussing how we perceive. And if we get to it, we'll be doing consciousness. So we've got, we'll be going over this territory quite a lot. Now we've added a second set of questions, improved questions. We can ask about metaphysics. We can ask about how we see the mental. If we are talking about feelings, do we think that maps onto a brain? Should we be looking for seeing in brains? Should we be looking for feelings in brains, for example? If we do, we're adopting one metaphysical position over another one. We're getting involved in that rather messy bun fight. So I know it doesn't seem like progress, but we're now in a position to come at complicated topics with an improved vocabulary, and that's kind of where we're going in this course. Now we've got Descartes standing in for rationalism. We need someone to stand in for the empiricist pole. And that's going to be a rather rotund and ruddy-faced Scotsman by the name of David Hume. Interestingly, and rather unusually in the pantheon of great philosophers of mind, he doesn't seem to have been much of a practicing Christian, and a lot of the slander thrown at David Hume during his life would have been that he was either an agnostic or an atheist. He was later than Descartes, so we're talking here the 18th century, but it still wasn't considered cool to come out and be a complete out-and-out atheist. These days, atheist is probably a default position for a lot of scientists, and we're not going to have a position here in this course on this at all, but when the topic is as deep as this, it's useful to ask and recognize what the commitments of the various people are. So Descartes' commitments led him to assume that there was such a thing as absolute certainty, for example. David Hume is quite happy with uncertainty. He emphasizes the role of the senses, and from him we have the clearest statement of this distinction between the senses as a source of knowledge and the intellect as a means of organizing that knowledge. So Hume assumes that everything we know we first learn through contact with the world. Before him, the other great empiricist, John Locke, had suggested that newborn babies are actually blank slates onto which experience then writes. So that everything you know, you come to know because of where you've been, who you've talked to, what you did, what you saw, what you smelt, and so on. Now, Hume recognized that this creates a problem, several problems, of course. One is that you can be wrong. He didn't worry too much about that. He was happy to live with a little bit of uncertainty. The fact that the eyes, the senses can be deceived didn't trouble him much because they work well most of the time. We rely on them to get around. We don't walk into lampposts. And optical illusions have to be carefully constructed. And if you're dreaming, hey, you're dreaming. You're not awake. And if you're hallucinating, well, you're just plumb wrong because you're on drugs or something. You know, he took a fairly commonsensical view of this, but he did recognize there was a bigger problem lurking, which is how do you get the ability to reason? Where does that come from? Now, there are limits to how far we can go in this course, but you can just see that he's emphasizing different concerns than Descartes. We're not going to resolve this. Immanuel Kant is the guy who really tried hardest to resolve this. But he thinks all knowledge originates in the evidence of the senses, and he recognizes that there are issues with how does that then become the stuff with which we reason? Where do we get our concepts from, our categories, and so on? Again, we don't want to pursue this. We don't have the means or the time to pursue this, but we do need to recognize this as a landmark. This empiricist question of how do we understand the role of the senses in grounding our knowledge is really, really important. Hume is important for lots of reasons, but this is a clear statement that we still must deal with in cognitive science as we come to study something we're going to call perception later on. Now, I really need to emphasize this, we're not talking about a competition between things here. What we've done is established extreme landmarks that can help us in teasing apart complex matters. Very often, you don't find these debates treated with a great deal of sensitivity in, for example, popular scientific writing or even journalists' outpouring. Here you might have met, for example, a nature-nurture debate. This is a clear example of the kind of simplistic thinking we want to avoid. Little Billy stole a car and got into trouble. And then the parents are down in the Garda station and they want to know, oh my God. And then this question comes up, well, is it the parents' fault? That's nurture, experience, empiricist experience, you know, that happened afterwards. Or is it little Billy's fault? Was he born bad? Right? And rationalists tend to emphasize they tend to view the newborn organism as being already equipped with the ability to reason, with the rudiments of intellect that will be necessary to understand the uncertain world that they're going to meet. Whereas an empiricist view would emphasize instead the effect of that which you meet on you. So if Descartes and David Hume had a kid, and the kid stole a car and they ended up down at the Garda station, there would probably be, they would come away with very different feelings. Descartes would sort of say, the kid was bad from the day one, whereas Hume would go, oh my God, I'm such a lousy parent, I taught him to steal cars. That kind of simplicity, you can see people like simple answers. We're not going to encourage that. We're going to try and get away from that. So we're going to use these as reference points, but not to remove debate. Finally, I want to show you an example of how practicing scientists can, under some circumstances, at least adopt a position with respect to all this complexity and say, ha! Now this is timely because the chap who's on your required reading for this week just died 3 days ago. His name is Marvin Minsky. And how many people have heard of Marvin Minsky? One or two. How many people have ever heard the term artificial intelligence? Come on, you've all heard the term artificial intelligence. He coined the term artificial intelligence. He was one of the founders of the MIT Media Lab where a lot of the early artificial intelligence work was done. And he tried to articulate a clear and simple, but whether it works or not is up for grabs, position with respect to this. It can be summed up very simply. Minds are what brains do. That's Minsky's view. That's not my view. And I've put it as the required reading for this week because I want you to see how it's a rare case of a scientist making moves with respect to all this complexity to establish a position from which it can then go on to do science. It's not the correct position. And please, just because it's required reading doesn't mean that I'm agreeing with Minsky or I'm trying to convince you to agree with Minsky. In fact, I feel very strongly that it's complete tosh. Minds are absolutely not what brains do. But I'm providing you with this reading so you can see a very popular and well-articulated position. This view is shared by very many neuroscientists, but by no means by all neuroscientists. So neuroscience is an area where this debate is going to be loud and where you can't really do good work unless you know something of these background positions that are necessary. Okay, we're just going to get a tiny bit of a start then on the second story that we have to tell, which is the story of the science of mind. We've just looked at the philosophy of mind. The science of mind, I'm going to call that's a term we might use for psychology, but it's actually, I don't think psychology was established as a science of mind. When you go back, it is interesting to go back and look at the origins of psychology, look at a time in which psychology became a proto-scientific discipline. And that is not so long ago. The term psychology has been used since the 1600s, but as a scientific domain, it only exists since the second half of the 19th century. You can't put an exact date on these things, but here's two dates that are perhaps very relevant. In 1879, the first experimental lab for psychology was opened up in Leipzig in Germany by Wilhelm Wundt, chap sporting a fine beard. Back then, all psychologists were men and they all had massive beards. It's changed a little bit since then. What was going on in Ireland in 1879? That was the year the Virgin Mary appeared at Knock. So we were a bit behind the times. The first textbook in psychology was written by this guy, William James, in 1890. Beautifully written textbook. He writes very, very well. William James came from a family that were very rich in both the humanities and the sciences, and his brother William James is a famous novelist, a point we'll just get back to in a minute. But let's just consider what the climate is at the end of the 19th century, so 1850 to 1900. Science has been around for a while. It's been around for 200 or 300 years as the scientific method with experiments and so on. And it's grown, and as it's grown, it started now to deliver dividends. It has changed, it's starting now to change people's lives. This is not something done by natural philosophers in Oxford University, but it's entering into people's lives. So changes in the physical and chemical sciences have given rise to engineering, which has given rise to the Industrial Revolution, which has changed the whole process of work and how stuff is produced. We've got consumerism, we've got factories, we've got the Industrial Revolution, as I said. We've got the atomic theory has come through. Physics and chemistry have really taken off. Chemistry is becoming systematized. Periodic table, we're really getting a handle on the atomic and molecular nature of reality, and that's producing benefits. We've got dyes, we've got chemicals which are transforming people's lives all the time. We've got electromagnetism. We're harnessing electricity. Electric life changed people fundamentally. It changed how they associated with each other, where they went, how they talked to each other. This is really changing people's lives. There's another really important development in science around this time, which is evolutionary theory. Prior to this, there was a great tendency, it was almost a default position, to regard humans as actually not part of nature. Humans were like angels in fleshy, in meaty bodies. It lives on to this day. When we speak about a division between the natural and the artificial, we're making use of a complicated, problematic distinction, because if we're not part of nature, what the hell are we? Of course we're a kind of animal. And it was evolutionary theory that helped people to begin to view themselves as continuous with other forms of life. Yes, we're special, but so are giraffes. You know, we're special in a human way, and giraffes are special in a giraffe way. And it was only through the Darwinian theory that we began to see how we could knit ourselves in there, which is challenging for the exceptionalist view that sees humans as having souls which are capable of salvation, but that's what science is doing. It's overturning this picture. So in the middle of all this, science is really paying off. Why wouldn't you turn the scientific method on ourselves? And as you do so, two goals sort of come into view simultaneously. One is you want to provide an account of human behavior. You want to explain why people do what they do. What are their motives? What are they trying to achieve? How can they fail? How can you help them? How can you stop them doing bad things? So behavior is a real concern here. But there's another concern here, and that is experience, lived experience, or what we would today maybe call consciousness. And that's best articulated by William James, who we just mentioned. He gave us this famous phrase, which has become part of the language now, the stream of consciousness. As you're sitting here, you're paying attention to me, but then you're drifting off and you're thinking about lunch, and then, ow, your toe is hurting. And as your mind flits around from lecture to lunch to toe, it's like a little bird landing and hopping off one branch or another. Or here he is. He says, consciousness does not appear to itself chopped up in bits, it flows. And he described a river or a stream are the metaphors by which it's most naturally described. Let us call it the stream of thought, the stream of consciousness, or of subjective life. So he introduced this wonderful idea, which fairly clearly articulates the second goal of psychology, to be a science of experience, underpinning, give us an account of why we feel as we do, why we come at the world, why we desire, want, and experience the world as we do. The notion of the stream of consciousness didn't revolutionize science. Not yet, anyway. We're still, the concerns are still valid. It did change modern literature, though. And the novels of his brother, Henry James, are part of the modernist tradition. And if you've ever read any James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or Dostoevsky in particular, what happens here with literature when they're describing characters in novels, for the first time they describe it as if you were inside the head of the character. So you get to, novelists are trying to capture this circulation of attention as your mind wanders from one thing to another. And the experience of the present is mixed up with memories and desires and beliefs, and there's a sense of uncertainty, and you're inside the character's head. The first time I read Crime and Punishment, I walked around for a week convinced I'd killed an old woman with an axe. When done well, it's very effective. So this psychological view revolutionizes literature, but it has yet really to find its fullest articulation or to be satisfactorily met in science. So we're going to leave it there for today. We're going to carry on with a very, very brief history of psychology next week on Tuesday. We'll see you then.